Welcome back, everyone. We'll kick off the afternoon panels now. We have the new age of economic warfare, where we'll focus on the economic aspects of the war in Ukraine. Our moderator for this session is Dean John Quelch from the University of Miami's Herbert School of Business. Our panelists include Chris Miller, Director, Eurasia, Greenmantle, and Dimitris, Valatsas, the Chief Economist at Greenmantle. I'll let you gentlemen take it away from here.
Great.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Very good of you to be stalwarts after lunch and to show up for this panel, which is going to be so memorable that all the people outside, you're going to tell them later, you missed a phenomenal event. You morons, you should have been in here. All right, let's hear it. Let's hear it for, these guys have come a long way to entertain us, believe me. Greenmantle, we have Chris Anderson, Chris Miller, who's the Director of Eurasia, and we have Dimitris Valatsas, who is the Chief Economist at Greenmantle. Welcome. And economic warfare is the subject of the panel. Obviously, there's been a lot of conversation about that, but is economic warfare, just to set the stage, Chris, is it new or has it been around for a while and we're just seeing the most extreme manifestation of it that we can remember in our recent history?
Well, I think there is nothing new about it, John, but for the past couple of decades, people have thought they could ignore its reality. If you think back to the collapse of the Soviet Union 40 years ago almost now, it's been 4 decades in which investors could ignore politics and in which people in the advanced world could ignore conflict. And that is now changing. The invasion of Ukraine is just the most vibrant example of that. But in fact, if you look across the world, you're seeing military conflict and geopolitical competition playing a bigger and bigger role in economics, in investing, in financial regulation. So whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's a whole range of assets that are being impacted by regulation, I think it's something we need to take a lot more seriously now than we have in the past couple of decades.
So we've had sanctions against Iran, we've had sanctions against Venezuela, we've had sanctions, economic sanctions, on and off, affecting many countries over the decades. But I don't recall the term economic warfare being used. So what's different this time round?
Well, the key difference is that now we're undertaking economic warfare against a major economy. Iran was a small economy. North Korea is a tiny economy. Russia's one of the bigger economies in the world stage, or at least it used to be. Now that's changed. And I think what's striking, if you look back to just 1 month ago, the number of people who thought what we're seeing right now was inconceivable, who thought it was impossible to predict, impossible to imagine we'd be in a place where one of the biggest economies in the world was under extraordinarily tough sanctions. But the reality is this was completely predictable. If you listened to what President Putin was threatening, if you watched his military movements, which were visible to anyone with satellite photos, you could see this coming from months in advance. And I think the striking thing is for everyone who was buying spare bank stock or not foreseeing what's going to happen in the oil markets was that this was a train wreck that was visible for weeks, if not months in advance.
Mm-hmm. So who do you think miscalculated more? Putin miscalculated the strength of the EU and US to combine and impose these sanctions, or the West underestimated the resolve of Putin to go all the way?
I think it is pretty clear it's the Russians that miscalculated. The US government, for all the intelligence failures that the US has had over the past couple of decades, they got this one exactly right. They were calling it an invasion months in advance, and no one believed them. It was extraordinary. No one believed them. But in fact, when you look at it, in November, the US was saying the Russians are going to invade with 200,000 troops, and even in the US, no one thought that was plausible. Putin had no idea that the economic response was going to be as large as it was, which is evident by the fact that they hadn't prepared for it. They had hundreds of billions of dollars in jurisdictions that were easily sanctionable, in currencies that were easily sanctionable, and they were shocked when their central bank was sanctioned. Had they expected it, they would have organized their finances differently. They were prepared for it, and they were totally unprepared for what just hit them.
Okay, so let me turn to Dimitris for a moment. So from the point of view of an economist, what does economic warfare mean for the ordinary American, if anything?
I think the clear effects will be seen in things like food prices and gasoline prices. People are talking about a repeat of the 1970s. We were in a pretty inflationary regime to begin with, and adding geopolitics, adding the commodity price shocks that we're seeing in both food, oil, and other commodities as well. That will hurt the U.S. consumer. That will slow down the recovery. I think that is the most of the effect that U.S. consumers will see. But I think the crucial point here is that economic warfare can be highly asymmetric. This is a development in which the Russians will feel the pain a lot more of a rupture in economic relations than the U.S. or even the Europeans will. Things are a lot worse in Europe because there's much more dependency on Russia, especially in the energy sphere. But it is something that the EU and its member states are rich enough to be able to get through. Not sure we can say the same about Russia. There's a really devastating developments for the Russian economy.
Now, let me just push back on. I recall that a certain president of the United States, President Trump, also thought he could take advantage of asymmetry because we imported so much more from China than they imported from the US, and so surely they were going to blink first. But that didn't happen. So is asymmetry necessarily a good predictor of the resolve of the other side?
I think that's an excellent point. I think the jury's still out on to what extent President Trump achieved his stated aims with his trade policy. Obviously, COVID distorts the data a lot. Some people would say we have a different framework now for relations with China, so that was a successful policy. Other people would say it contributed to inflation. So I think the jury is still out on that. But you make a very good point. It's hard to see, especially with autocratic regimes, and we've seen that in history. Sanctions do not tend to lead to regime change. We have sanctions on Cuba. And the revolution there was many, many decades ago. We still have sanctions on Iran. We still have sanctions on Venezuela. All of these places, it is the same regime that is in place today as it was when the US implemented, at times, very, very harsh sanctions, such as on Iran. So I think we should tone down our hopes a bit and understand that there are things that economic warfare cannot do. And regime change is a very, very difficult thing to achieve.
Okay. So I'm going to take some questions from the audience because I think we're talking about current events, and I'm sure many of you have some very good questions for our two experts. But just before doing that, let me ask you, if I may, do we in the West have more economic bullets to fire, or have we fired all of them? And if not, what are the remaining bullets that are still left? And when all the economic bullets are fired, what happens then?
Well, I think we should be ready for more economic bullets to be fired vis-a-vis Russia. Energy sanctions are going to intensify over the coming weeks. The EU is going to, over the next month, impose an oil embargo on Russia. It's not ready to yet, but it's going to soon as civilian casualties intensify in Ukraine. Most people think the war is going to end in a couple days, a couple weeks. We should be ready for a long war in Ukraine. Not guaranteed, but it's certainly plausible. People don't want to think about that future. It'd be a grim future, but it's a very real possible outcome. And so long as this war continues, energy sanctions will only intensify. And although it'll be costly for the US and Europe, it's survivable in economic terms, and it's better, as you say, than the alternative of a hot war, which we certainly don't want to break out in Europe. But I think it's not only with Russia where we should expect economic warfare to be part of the game plan going forward. There's a lot of questions one can ask about Trump's policies towards China, but what's clear is Biden has kept most of them in place. There's a bipartisan consensus in the US in favor of tough economic policies on China in the trade sphere with tariffs, but also in the tech sphere with semiconductors. And a lot of the sanctions that Biden has put on Russia are ripped out of Trump's China playbook and imposed on Russia, hitting semiconductors, hitting aviation, hitting shipbuilding, a whole range of sectors. These are new tools the US is learning about right now as they employ them. We should expect a lot more of this in the future, and not only against Russia. I think China is really target number one for a lot of policymakers in Washington.
So if you were advising Xi Jinping regarding how to answer Putin's call for aid to circumvent the sanctions, how would you advise him?
I think the Chinese right now are bargain hunting for cheap Russian commodities. They realize they've got a country that's heavily reliant on them. Russia's only hope is for China to keep bailing them out. Russia needs the customer, and so it's in a very, very weak position. China can get whatever it wants in that relationship.
And China would do that even though Washington is calling, saying don't do it.
I think we should assume it's probably already happening.
Yeah. How do you see a protracted war when it comes to impact on the world economy and inflation and GDP growth?
I think we're in a period of time where we're reliving the late 60s and early 70s, but in an accelerated fashion. A protracted war means that 5 million barrels of Russian exports are not going to hit the market. We already see about 70% of that disrupted because Western firms are not willing to purchase Russian oil, they're not willing to refine Russian oil, Western dock workers are not willing to unload Russian oil. So we already have kind of quasi-sanction environment, and obviously that comes at a situation where inflation in the US is already extraordinarily high by the standards of the past 40 years for reasons of basically fiscal and monetary overkill in 2021. So we're not economically at our strongest to take that hit, and I think that could derail inflation expectations, leading to an inflationary overshoot over the duration of the business cycle. I know, a lot of people were saying that inflation was transitory and it was only this particular sector, this particular supply chain. There's basically no sector in the US economy that hasn't been affected. And I think the shock of what's happening in Russia is positioning us for another half decade of way above target inflation in the United States and in Europe.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to make yourself unpopular and predict a recession or not?
I think we're far from a recession in the United States, given where energy prices are today. We're much closer to one in Europe. I still don't think we'll get one this year, but I think it's worth remembering that on net, the United States is not a net energy importer. It depends a little bit on the caloric value of the products, but it's basically flat vis-a-vis the world. So when oil gets more expensive, it's not that America gets poorer, it's that particular Americans get richer and particular Americans get poorer. And from a GDP sense, it's nowhere near as bad as Europe, which imports around 61% of its energy. So no, I wouldn't go that far. I think the developments are stagflationary. I think we're living through something like the 70s. Not quite sure we'll get to a recession this year.
What does stagflation actually mean?
It just means that you get a shock, a commodity shock, for example, that at the same time raises prices, and because it lowers consumers' disposable income, creates a drag on growth. Economists used to think that's not possible. You could only get inflation if you had growth, if you had above trend growth. That's the inflation we got last year. Now we get the nasty sort of inflation where we all get poorer, make less money, buy fewer things while having inflation.
Just one final question before we open it up, and I will open it up immediately after this question, so get your questions ready. So how can Europe possibly wean itself off of Russian oil and gas to the point where it can impose a ban on imports from Russia?
Europe's reliant on Russian gas in particular, but it's not that expensive. If Europe were to cut itself off tomorrow, according to the best estimates by German economists, completely cold turkey from any Russian energy, coal, oil, or gas, hit to GDP would be a couple of percentage points. So that's big, but it's not catastrophic. This is not wartime levels of suffering.
There are alternative supplies available and capable of being brought into Germany, for example, that quickly?
You can fill with some LNG, you can conserve some more, you can take some things offline. When you put it all together, you can keep your nuclear power plants back online, bring them back online for longer. When you put it all together, it's not nearly as expensive as it might sound.
Okay. All right, so that's a German Green New Deal that is a bit more than they bargained for.
There you go.
Yeah. All right, let's see if there's some questions from the audience. And before I call on you, ma'am, I'm going to remind everybody here what a question is. So a question is a single sentence that ends with a question mark, okay? So if you feel that you can live up to that modest expectation, I'll be happy to call on you. Can you do that? Okay, well, give it your best shot, okay? Please use the mic. Go ahead.
I know this is probably a speculative question, but how likely probability is this contained to Ukraine and doesn't go to other former Soviet Union countries and spread to Europe?
I think it's pretty clear that it's not going to spread to other post-Soviet countries for the simple reason that Russia doesn't have the military resources for it. 75% of Russian ground fighting power is currently engaged in Ukraine, and Russia's got a lot of borders to defend. They're already vulnerable. There are fewer Russian troops today on the border with China than at any point since the 1920s. So Russia's already gone all in on Ukraine. There's really nothing left if you look at other countries in the post-Soviet space. The risk of escalation is not that Russia tries to invade Poland or tries to invade Romania. It's that as Russia strikes the convoys of US and NATO arms coming from Poland into Ukraine, Russia either accidentally or deliberately lets a couple of missiles or a couple of bombs cross the border and does strike Poland. That's the escalatory risk we need to worry about. And it's not hard to imagine Russian missiles straying off course. Over the weekend, Russia struck a Ukrainian military facility just a couple miles on the Ukrainian side of the Polish-Ukrainian border. It's very plausible to imagine one of those missiles having gone astray and landing in Poland, and that would be a serious crisis. I think that's the risk, not that Russia voluntarily tries to expand the war. The reality is that Russia's in a mess it can't deal with and is trying to find a face-saving way out right now.
Okay. So you're implying that the West has the upper hand at this point?
Well, Putin's not going to give in. He's not going to surrender and go home, but he's looking for a way to cut his costs. He thought the war would be over in a matter of days, and he'd waltz into Kiev. And now he's lost more forces in Ukraine in 3 weeks of fighting than the Soviets lost in years of fighting in Afghanistan. He's lost more forces in 3 weeks than the US lost in 20 years of warfare in Iraq.
Okay. Do the Russian people know that? And if they knew it, would they do anything about it or have the ability to do anything about it?
Putin has admitted for the first time that there are casualties being taken, not only among contract soldiers, but among draftees as well. Certainly the Russian state propaganda is intense. It's based largely on fictions. I watch some Russian TV every day as part of my job. I don't recommend it, bad for your health. But the scale of casualties is such that you can't cover it up.
Okay.
Thousands and thousands.
All right, let's take the gentleman in the middle with the jacket first. Can you get a microphone over there quickly? No, wait for the mic, because you may think you can be heard, but at the back it's probably not possible.
Okay. What sort of impact on inflation would we have if the United States decides to go full bore with oil drilling on public land?
Dimitris, can you handle this one?
You wouldn't have any immediate impact because it would take some time to come online. It would be very hard to replace 5 million barrels of global supply. But I think just from an economic kind of equilibrium perspective, if you were able to find $5 million a day in the United States and supply this to the global markets, then that would be very, very deflationary. I think there's no doubt about that.
All right, question. But like now that I know your views on how Russia's performing, I think I have an idea what the answer will be. What do you think of the possibility of China, Russia, and even countries like India and the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia and UAE, creating their own alternative to SWIFT and their own monetary system so that they don't have to rely on the US anymore?
Well, my view is that we've vastly overestimated the importance of SWIFT itself. And if you talk to sanctions experts in the US Treasury, they'll tell you the exact same thing. This is also why a lot of people overestimate the possibility of using cryptocurrency to avoid sanctions, because it's not just the payment rail that matters, it's also the bank at the start and the bank at the end. And so the US can sanction the bank at the start of a transaction, it can sanction SWIFT, the messaging system, and it can sanction the bank at the end. So no matter what system you've got transmitting messages between the banks, the US can sanction the entire way through. So that's why Russia found it impossible to keep its reserves anywhere, because there was no bank in the world where the Russians could deposit $300 billion worth of FX outside of China, and China got capital controls. So SWIFT itself, I think you can overstate the importance of. The point is the US can sanction every single part of the process, and it's been very good at doing that in traditional banking. It's moving into the crypto space very, very, very rapidly, precisely because people are concerned in Washington that crypto will be used as a way to try to avoid sanctions, and the Treasury's got all the tools they need to make that very, very, very costly.
So just to follow on, you're saying that China cannot, even if it wished to, really bail out Russia by providing the yuan and its equivalent of SWIFT as an alternative mechanism.
That's right. China can trade with Russia bilaterally using Chinese banks and Chinese payment mechanisms.
Can continue.
Can continue, that's right.
Yeah.
But the rest of Russia's trade relies on the dollar. And for China to do that requires the US Treasury not to impose secondary sanctions on Chinese banks, which the US hasn't done yet, but still could and would do if there was signs of substantial Chinese evasion. And if you think about Iran, the US has forced China to buy substantially less oil from Iran, even though China thinks the sanctions are illegitimate and says it's not implementing them.
I see. Okay. We'll take the gentleman. Yes, sir. Yep.
Given the Biden administration's recent decision on the Polish Migs, do you think there's a probability that in 10 or 15, 20 years from now, we're going to look back and say, once again, the U.S. traded its economic interests for doing the right thing in Ukraine, given the humanitarian crisis there?
You know, to be honest, if you dig into the details of the Polish Migs, it's not clear that that's really what the Ukrainians need right now. Ukraine is succeeding in aerial warfare because of its drones that it's buying from Turkey, not because of its traditional aircraft fleet. Of the Polish Migs, only 5 of them are operational. The rest need to be serviced first in Germany and then supplied in some sort of way to the Ukrainians. So most people who focus on Ukrainian aerial warfare say the Migs weren't really what the Ukrainians need. What they need and what they're about to get is more surface-to-air missiles. So Bulgaria, Poland, other countries in Eastern Europe that operate Soviet-era surface-to-air missiles of the type that the Ukrainians know how to use are transferring their air defense systems to Ukraine right now. And the Ukrainians, with a matter of weeks, will be able to deploy those against the Russian Air Force.
Slightly odd question, but how come you're so well informed? Tell us a little bit about your background, which explains that.
Well, I'm a historian of Russia by training. I've done a lot of research on Russia's economy, but also spent a lot of time living in Moscow and got to know the military establishment and the sort of foreign policy establishment there quite well.
Okay. Another question. Bruce, yeah. Wait for the mic if you wouldn't mind.
So because of your expertise, what happened to the mighty Red Army that defeated Germany in World War II? And did the CIA and Western intelligence understand how hollowed out it apparently is?
Well, what happened is that they hadn't trained for this type of operation since the Soviet period. The wars that Russia has fought since the collapse of the Soviet Union in Georgia 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 and Syria over the past couple of years have all been relatively small scale, involving several thousand, not several tens of thousands of troops, fighting an adversary that was not at all prepared for the type of war that Russia was able to wage. This time is different. The scale is an order of magnitude larger, and the Ukrainians have been preparing since 2014 for exactly this war. The Russians simply weren't ready for it. They've invested a lot in newer technology, but haven't figured out how to use it properly on the battlefield. And the Ukrainians, I think, have been very smart in finding ways to use their less sophisticated equipment to negate Russian advantages. I think on top of that, Putin hugely miscalculated by thinking the Ukrainians would surrender on day one. The reality is Putin was drinking his own Kool-Aid, he believed his own propaganda that Ukraine was weak, and so planned a war that didn't involve any resistance. That was set up to failure. No, the U.S. was surprised by how badly Russia's fighting the war.
So, Dimitris, what would be the best outcome for the world economy at this point? An immediate truce?
Clearly, the best outcome for the world economy would be immediate ceasefire, truce, and some sort of negotiated peace. But you have to think politics and economics are interwoven here, and what appears to us as the most immediate concern of the day, in the US and the EU, that would be growth and inflation, might actually not be optimal for, say, Western democracies in the long run. Maybe a quick and easy truce with Putin is not what Western economies need over a, say, 20-year horizon. And this is a lot of the work we do at Greenmantle tries to bring in history and understand these trade-offs between what seems, short-term expedient, like ramping up oil production or making concessions to Russia, versus, the long-term interest of, end of the day, free societies in how to confront this type of regimes.
Right. I think there was another question over here. Yes, on the aisle.
What would George Kennan do?
That's one for you, Chris.
George Kennan, obviously the diplomat who devised the concept of containment in early Cold War. George Kennan lived until he was over 100 years old, and so he had the benefit, but also the misfortune of writing op-eds on a regular basis over the course of his career. So over 100 years, he took almost every side of every issue in different articles that he wrote. I think, there's a question of, once the war between Russia and Ukraine is over, what do you do with the rest of Russia? And a lot of Americans are hoping that the war ends with Putin being knifed in the back by one of his security chiefs or retiring to the Black Sea coast. There's some chance that happens, but it's far from guaranteed. I think we've got to assume that Putin's in power, base case, when the war ends. And then the US and Europe does face a dilemma. What do you do with this guy? He's still going to be there. And if not him, someone with the exact same background as him from the KGB, everyone else in power, including everyone who could knife him in the back, is also a 40-year veteran of the KGB. So I think we shouldn't assume that the Russia dilemma is going to go away even when this war ends. And I'm not even sure this war is going to end anytime soon.
Who's the best person to broker a truce?
I think the Israelis actually have great relations with both the Ukrainians and the Russians.
Okay. On the aisle. Sorry, I didn't realize you were over here.
Are there surprises to liquidity pressures in the global financial pipes as a result of this conflict?
I think there are a few surprises. Some of the things that we expected would implode, so certain European banks with specific exposure to Russia now have to mark that down to zero, and obviously that has to get taken out of their capital and therefore out of their stock price. So we've seen a bit of that, but I think overall the financial system has behaved largely as we'd expect as a consequence of the sanctions, because end of the day, Russia is a very small node in the global financial system.
So nothing that could happen down the road as a result of this, as the impact pushes through the system, that we should keep our eyes open to?
I mean, absolutely. There's a lot of, this is a very levered world. We're coming at the end of incredibly low interest rates. We've had 0% interest rates for the most of the past decade. In real terms, our real interest rate in the United States is either -6 or -8%, depending on whether you take expected or realized inflation. So we have deeply, deeply negative rates. That creates all sorts of bubbles across all sorts of asset classes. I think if the second order effect, suppose, for example, I'm wrong and we do get a recession this year and it impacts, say, the housing market at the same time as the Fed has to hike rates, I think that would be very stressful for the financial system. It wouldn't be a 2008 situation because we've fixed the problems of 2008 in terms of regulation, but something else could definitely come up. I think that would be where the worry is, not the measures against Russia, but any second order effects on the US economy.
And on that upbeat note, we'll have to end the session. Thank you, Dimitris. Thank you, Chris. And thanks for all of the good questions.